Hello, my name is Melissa Golding, and I'm the press officer for the Group of 30. I'd like to welcome all of you to today's live webinar launch of the G30's report, Why Does Latin America Underperform? Today's webinar will include remarks from Arminio Fraga, co-chair of the Group of 30 Working Group on Latin America and former governor of the Central Bank of Brazil. Guillermo Ortiz, co-chair of the Group of 30 Working Group on Latin America and former finance minister of Mexico and governor of the Bank of Mexico. Andres Velasco, project director of the Group of 30 Working Group on Latin America and former minister of finance of Chile. And Lawrence H. Summers, member of the Working Group on Latin America and former United States Secretary of the Treasury. Please note everyone will be speaking today on behalf of the Group of 30's Working Group on Latin America. They are here to discuss the report and to answer questions about the report from the webinar audience. They are participating in this webinar in their personal capacities, and their participation does not imply the support of their respective public and private institutions. I'd now like to introduce Guillermo Ortiz, co-chair of the G30 Working Group on Latin America. Dr. Ortiz?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Arminio and I started thinking about, why is Latin America not doing well compared to our peers. Several months ago, almost a year ago, we immediately got in touch with Andres, and then the three of us started, going back and forth. And finally, we have a report which has had the benefit of a very active and distinguished working group, including former central bank governors, finance ministers, academics. So we're also very happy to have Larry join us today and part of the working group. And without further ado, let's begin with Andres. Andres will give us an overview, of the paper, and then Arminio will make some remarks on Brazil. I will do the same for Latin America, and Larry will kind of wrap it up and see it from the U.S. perspective.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to work on this report, and congrats to the Group of 30 for focusing on Latin America, a region that does not always get a great deal of attention in international circles or in the US. The report is quite long and nuanced, and I will not try to summarize every bit of it. Instead, let me just make some points emphasizing the issues and items which I think are more worth discussing, perhaps in this group. Start with what is going on today. The fact is that Latin American growth prospects are dim. Latin America, like the rest of the world, had a sharp dip during the pandemic. Then there was a very quick recovery. But since last year, what the numbers are showing and what projections are showing for the next few years is simply low and mediocre growth pretty much everywhere, including in certain countries where there was a fairly fast spurt of growth in the previous decade. Now that's today. The problem is that the growth issue did not arise with the pandemic. It dates back at least a decade. Pretty much since the end of the commodity crisis, Latin America has been underperforming. And if in fact you take a longer view, as the paper does, and you look at the last 3 or 4 decades, Latin America has systematically underperformed relative to developed countries. And this is, of course, not what theory would predict. Standard economic theory suggests that conditional on a number of things, poorer countries should grow faster and someday catch up to richer countries. This has not happened to Latin America. In the last pick your favorite period, 3 decades, 4 decades, 5 decades, even as long as 6 decades, the region on average has grown much less than the frontier, epitomized by the United States. And even a few fast growers like Panama or Chile have failed to catch up over the long haul. Now, Latin America has not only underperformed relative to the developed countries, it has underperformed also relative to peers. One thing the paper does is build a group of peers, meaning countries that are roughly in the same stage of development as Latin America and which have comparable per capita incomes. This includes countries in East Asia, a number in Eastern Europe, and a few around the world like Turkey or South Africa. A striking finding of the paper is that Latin America as a group does worse than the peers in many categories, including growth, including investment, openness, and export performance. So it's not simply a problem of underperformance vis-a-vis the rich, it's also underperformance vis-a-vis the world's middle class, to which Latin America belongs. Striking feature of the underperformance is poor productivity growth. We show some estimates that suggest that over the last few decades, productivity growth has contributed zero, almost exactly zero, to overall growth. And this is in contrast to both advanced countries and East Asian emerging countries, where productivity growth systematically contributes to ongoing economic growth. Now, the standard story about Latin America, and this is a story that is many decades old, is that the region underperforms because of bad macro. If you have high inflation, high debt, large fiscal deficits, a lot of uncertainty, well, naturally, no country can grow under those circumstances. I'm happy to report, and the report reports, that this story no longer fits all of the region. It continues to fit a subset of nations, of which Venezuela and Argentina are the most prominent, and not the only ones. But that standard story that says that bad macro explains low growth no longer fits a number of countries, among them Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, and Uruguay, where the macro may not be perfect, but it is much better than most people would have forecasted a decade or two ago. So an enduring puzzle in the region is not why Argentina or Venezuela do not grow, that's fairly obvious, is why countries with fairly good macro and countries that have also undertaken a number of reforms are failing to grow. One prime example is Mexico, but I will not say more about Mexico because Guillermo will talk about Mexico. But it is also true of Colombia, Peru, and Chile, which had growth spurts, but in contrast to countries in East Asia, these growth spurts were short-lived. Some of the drop in the sustainable rates of growth in countries like Colombia, Peru, and Chile may be due to a recent deterioration in the policy environment. But by world standards, the policy environment in these countries is not as bad as it is in many other emerging and developing countries. So that cannot explain all of the lack of growth. It would seem that in these countries, an absence of high return projects, particularly in the export sectors, that the private sector can undertake, are also part of the explanation for low growth. So there are many market failures and government failures that need to be addressed to improve these investment opportunities and in turn the growth prospects of the region. And the report gives a number of suggestions and a bit more detail about this. Let me make 3 more points briefly and I will end. My next point is about inequality, which of course remains a huge issue in Latin America. I do not want to deny that for 1 second. But the report does emphasize that the standard narrative that says that Latin American inequality had been rising and that accounted for a lot of the social unrest that happened right before the pandemic, that narrative is likely a bit too simplistic and a poor basis for policy. And the main reason for that is that until the pandemic, in fact, inequality, at least as measured by household surveys, had been dropping, not rising, in most countries of the region. One question is, well, was it luck, namely high commodity prices, or was it good policy that accounted for the drop in inequality? And the answer to that question will depend on which country it is that we're talking about. But the fact is that, yes, inequality had been dropping, and therefore we cannot simply say that it was a rise in inequality that took people to the streets. The paper offers a few alternative hypotheses about the causes of unrest, which I'll be happy to address in the Q&A if anybody is interested. Now, when it comes to inequality, the real issue is what the pandemic did, and particularly, what are likely to be the very nasty implications of a very long period of school closure. Schools were closed in Latin America longer than pretty much any other region of the world, and that does terrible and fairly evident damage to human capital, to people's future livelihoods, but also to the prospects for economic growth. Let me end by saying something about institutions. Another standard narrative in Latin America is that weak institutions account for bad economic performance. And of course, there's some truth to that. And particularly in countries with weak rule of law and where the problem of organized crime is getting worse, as Guillermo and Arminio will probably remark, weak institutions are an issue. However, if you compare the institutions of Latin America to the institutions in the peer group, and the paper makes this point, institutions in Latin America are no worse. And in fact, in a number of countries are quite a bit better, Uruguay, Costa Rica, Chile, than in the peer group. So a mechanical story that says that institutions account for all the difference is not sufficient either. There are also some happy stories. One institution which seems to have been getting better in Latin America is central banks. Central banks, in fact, as the report details, were active and early in fighting the inflation spike. And so we can count that as one institutional success. But one area where obvious room for institutional improvement exists, it's political systems. And this is the last point I want to make. For many years in much of the world, we all used to repeat, well, it's the economy stupid. I think it is fair to say that in Latin America today, it is the politics stupid. And political difficulties, of course, are many and varied. We do not mean to summarize them all in one statement, but there's one area where there's low-hanging fruit for reform. The report provides more detail, and that is the structure of political decision-making. Latin America is fairly unique in the world in having presidential systems like the US, but proportional electoral systems like Europe. And this combination does not work because it produces governments that control the executive, but which do not have a majority in Congress. That means that programs that were sold to the electorate at election time cannot be implemented. And this is a perfect recipe for citizen frustration and for the growing disenchantment with democracy we see in the region today. We have some suggestions in the paper about areas where this could be improved, but clearly in politics, there's a great deal of room for improvement. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay. So a few words on Brazil, but before that, Andres, thank you again. You've been the most wonderful project leader. We're very, very, very grateful for that. I once heard from a boss in my early days work that Brazil was never as good as it looked. It was never as bad as it looked. And the path we've sort of struggled to pursue over the last 4 decades is proof of that. But the end result seems to have had both sides of the coin, good and bad, but more bad than good, in my view. And here's why. I mean, if you look at, say, Brazil's income per capita as a proportion of the US, since the peak of that ratio in circa 1980, we are down 30%. So this has been a disastrous period for us. The number is down even from 1994, when the Real Plan finally got rid of hyperinflation and the economy was opening up. Many good things happened, but even then, Brazil has had a decline in income per capita relative to the US. This is very frustrating. One way to look at this is macro. In our case, we haven't found yet a solution to trouble. We have had 2 of the last 4 decades with drops in income per capita, and a lot of this is macro, even though it's not the old macro version of, say, the early days of this period with hyperinflation and debt defaults. It was still a source of tremendous uncertainty, high interest rates, and so on. There has been a lot of progress since the Cardoso and the Lula days, Lula's first term in particular. But even during this period that was very exciting for us for often, and I was very hopeful of where Brazil was heading at that point. Even then, we have had a collapse in productivity since then that is shocking. And the reasons are too long to dwell on. Our report talks a lot about these issues, including a little bit on Brazil, and I will not go on this. And just to sum up, to end my remarks, I would say the following. The question that is in my mind relates to Brazil and also to Latin America, and we make it very clear in our report, is really, why don't we learn? You know, it's very, very frustrating to see that we don't learn from either good or bad experiences. So this has hurt us tremendously. The macro environment is still not there. We still feel we're going into another round of growing debt ratios, and with the interest rates we have here, this is a real issue. There is no basic consensus on a development strategy, and we also pay a price. We badly need a round of, call it, reforms of the state. There's no case in history of a country that has developed fully without a well-functioning state, be it small, mid-sized, or large. And I'll end pretty much paraphrasing Andres. Our political system, in part for the reasons he pointed out, has yet to get its act together on a vision of Brazil's development that is, basically absent at this point. And I'll end here. Guillermo, ball on your court. Thank you.
Okay, let me follow up on Arminio and talk a bit about Mexico. As it was mentioned, I think, by Andres, thinking about Latin America is almost an exercise in frustration, of missed opportunities, of not learning from our mistakes, as Arminio was saying. And Mexico stands out as a prime example. I mean, let me summarize what I'm going to say about Mexico, citing 2 puzzles. One is an economic puzzle, and the second one is a political puzzle. The economic puzzle is the fact that Mexico has been, we have had our share of economic crisis. The last one being the tequila crisis in the 90s, But since then, we've had 2.5 decades of economic stability, ups and downs, contaminated by crises like the the great financial crisis, but the macro has held up pretty well. On the other hand, Mexico is a very open economy. 80% of our exports are manufacturing. Mexico has become the largest trading partner with the U.S., displacing China. It's a sophisticated economy. Producing a vast array of goods. If you look at the Index of Economic Complexity developed by Harvard, by the OECD, Mexico looks much more like a country like Malaysia or Poland, in terms of industrial capacity. Total exports in Mexico are 3 times manufacturing, 3 times the sum of all of Latin America. Why is it that, given all these advantages, the free trade agreement and so on, Mexico has performed so poorly? And obviously, the issues of productivity that have been mentioned are very important. And there's a long list of that. I'm not going to go into that. But in my mind, there are 2, big stumbling blocks. One is that Mexico is really not one Mexico, but at least 2 Mexicos. We have a northern part that is very different from the southern part of Mexico. Just to give you a number, income per capita in New York, income per capita in Nuevo León is 6 times the income per capita in Chiapas. In contrast, in the US, the difference between Connecticut and Mississippi, the highest and lowest income per capita is 3 times. So in Mexico, it's double. And in the US, regional disparities are also pretty high. So these regional disparities have only been growing through time, and now with the advent of nearshoring, which is something that is important and that's happening in Mexico. In investment, both domestic and foreign, is booming. I never thought I would live to see labor shortages in Mexico, but it's happening in the northern part. Okay? So and these regional disparities have really, had a big impact in many aspects, income distribution and so on and so forth. And it's something that, again, will get wider unless economic policies are put in place and attention is really paid to infrastructure, education, health services, and so on in the southern part of Mexico. Again, nearshoring is a big opportunity. I will not talk about it very much, but the projections that people made are good, and it's already happening. We can see it in the numbers of foreign investment and so on. Second big problem, and that was mentioned briefly by Andres, is the growing impact of drug mafias in Mexico. They now control substantial territories in different states. They supplant the role of the state. They have diversified internationally, and they are, leading now the human trafficking. You have literally hundreds of thousands of migrants in the U.S.-Mexico border, and each crossing is thousands of dollars. So you can imagine the business. It has also been, these drug gangs have been transnational. They're all everywhere in Latin America. Part of the Sinaloa cartel was blamed for the recent murder of an Ecuadorian presidential candidate. I will not go further into that, but to point out that this is the biggest challenge facing Mexico. And to conclude with this part, it's pretty obvious that, and this is Larry's turf, which is the connection between Mexico and the US. It is, if you think about it, it's totally absurd. Mexico supplies the fentanyl that causes 100,000 people to die every year in the US. The precursors come from China, but the drug gangs, export this to fentanyl to the US. And on the other hand, the US has 50,000 weapon stores, many of them situated in the border with Mexico and the US. So the armed guard, the gangs are armed with US weapons, which in turn are used to fight the state and produce all the drugs that are killing Americans. So that's one obvious point of cooperation, which is not happening because of politics. I don't want to go more into that, except to end my remarks on a political note. The political paradox is that our current leader, Andres Manuel López Obrador, has 60% popularity. I mean, he's in his 5th year of government, and it's unusual for a president to be that popular, particularly when surveys point out that people are very discontent with what the government is doing in terms of security, in terms of health, in terms of education, and so on, particularly security. So it's very odd. It's like López Obrador is not the head of the government. The government is doing badly, but López Obrador, he's a master communicator, and he, has a press conference, a 2-hour press conference every day. So he sets the agenda. And the interesting part, and I'm going to end my remarks on this, is that the opposition has put together a candidate, who comes from humble origins and has just an amazing career in terms of studying mathematics, economics, entrepreneur, going into politics. So the elections next year got a lot more interesting, and it coincides 2024 with the election in the US. So it will be interesting. And I'm also very interested in hearing what Larry has to say. Please, Larry, go on.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege for me as a North American to join with this distinguished group of Latin Americans to launch the report that they have prepared, which I was honored to sign on to, and I think is really a first-rate effort at analysis. I would make 3 observations. First, there is a deep puzzle here. If you had asked me when I had worked very closely with Guillermo as the finance minister of Mexico, and in 1997, Mexico had paid back all of the emergency loans that the United States had provided after the tequila crisis. If you had asked me, would I be pleased if no other Mexican election period was marked by financial crisis after 5 in a row had been between 1976 and 1994? Would I be pleased if Mexican inflation had stayed as low as it had? Would I be pleased if Mexico's credit spread was frequently under 200 basis points? Would I be pleased if trade between Mexico and the United States under NAFTA increased as much as it had? I would have answered that I would be thrilled and that I would regard it as an extremely good outcome. And yet, if you had asked me, what would I think about the GDP growth experience Mexico has had over the subsequent 26 years, what would I think about the growth in real wages that Mexico has had for 26 years? I think I would have been quite disappointed that Mexico had not done better. And so in many ways, Mexico's story, and I think the story of many other parts of Latin America, is a story of macroeconomic virtue not fully rewarded, or even macroeconomic virtue unrewarded. And I think that is a large challenge for economic policy, and it is a challenge for economic policymakers. It teaches, I think, that the concerns of people like the people on this call with matters financial and central banking are necessary for success, but that they are not sufficient for success. That, as I've often said, no matter how the misguided monetary and fiscal policies can do almost infinite damage to any economy, but no matter how brilliantly twiddled the dials of fiscal and monetary policy are not sufficient to bring a country prosperity and rapid growth, which depends upon the skill of its workers, the creativity and drive of its businesses, and above all, the quality of its institutions. And it is these matters that I think loom critical in the years ahead for success in much of Latin America. And I think this report is coming particularly from a group of macroeconomically oriented people, is very important in pointing to those factors. And I think the great challenge for economic policy in Latin America, and indeed in many places, is moving beyond macroeconomic virtue, which is right, and the condemnation of populism, which is also right, to fostering a synthesis that is sufficient to generate continuing prosperity. That brings me to my second observation. An important theme that I used to talk about as a Treasury official in the 1990s was convergence within the Americas. And I used to speak about the importance of democracy by the people also being effective democracy for the people. I confess that at that time, I had principally in mind the convergence of the Southern Americas towards North America. I envisioned convergence in GDP figures, convergence in reductions in inequality in Latin America, the movement towards a more long-term and less populist approach to government, movements towards a more open and internationalist approach to trade, reductions in the amount of crony capitalism between governments and businesses. And I saw, in important respects, the ways in which the United States had evolved over time as a model for many aspects of Latin American development. It gives me no joy to report today that no small part of the convergence, if it has occurred, has been in the other direction. That the United States has, in important respects, moved towards more closed economic nationalist, even protectionist policy approaches, that our democracy is less inclusive and more fragile than it felt a quarter century ago, and that issues of the rule of law loom larger today than they did at that time. And so there is, I think, more in common for us to think about in the Americas than perhaps I felt during the 1990s. The last observation that I would make is that the authors of the report, and it is, I think, admirable, emphasize what Latin America can, should, and even must do for itself if it is to promote prosperity and to meet the aspiration of its peoples. I was sorry that there is not more discussion of the role of the international community. The United States has had a long history of initiatives towards Latin America, emphasizing the flow of capital, emphasizing freer trade, emphasizing the exchange of ideas. And I think it is unfortunate that Latin America has not been more prominent on the US policy agenda during the 21st century. Part of that, to be fair, is a reflection of the fact that Latin America has not had wars and has not had financial catastrophes and has not had famines. And there is a tendency for the urgent to crowd out the profoundly important. But I think a nation that aspires to leadership in the way that the United States does has erred substantially in the 21st century in not paying more attention to maintaining close relationships, to seeking advice on matters geopolitical, to promoting common prosperity, to encouraging the exchange of peoples with Latin America than we have. And I think in a world of superpower competition, whereas we have pulled back, others have stepped forward, history may remember that as a serious error. And so as I think about aspirations for Latin America in the future, I hope that on the agenda of secretaries of state, secretaries of the Treasury, national security advisors, secretaries of commerce, and presidents of the United States, that the common challenges of the Americas and the common opportunities in the Americas will be larger going forward and play a more prominent role on the agenda. Thank you very much. Back to you, Melissa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Summers. We will now begin the Q&A portion of the webinar. Our first question is from Maris Limetz at the Bank of Estonia. They ask, sequential federal and state level election cycles seem to hinder some Latin American countries from carrying out necessary policy changes as the country is in a constant pre-election phase. Are there any solutions that maintain democratic processes but allow some breathing time for politicians to actually carry out economic policies?
I'll be happy to take a crack at that. And thank you, Arminio, Guillermo, and Larry for those comments on the report and comments on the state of the world. I think the question points to a serious issue, and that issue is part of a broader problem. As I said in my earlier remarks, there's a lot we can do to improve the way we run our politics. Let me elaborate on one point that I made earlier. If you look around the world, there are many countries that are presidential and have very majoritarian systems. The US is the foremost example that works. Countries that are parliamentary and have majoritarian systems, the UK, and much of the time that works. Parliamentary systems with proportional representation, continental Europe, and that works. Latin America is quite unique in having presidents with fixed terms of office, American style, with having a Congress with fixed terms of office, American style, but a Congress that is elected under a very different system with very, very large districts. Arminio will correct me here, but some districts in Sao Paulo have, more than a dozen congressmen or women in one single district. And this means that we have 20, 25, 30 political parties in parliament. My own country today, Chile has 22. I think Brazil has 25 or something in that order of magnitude. And with 25 political parties, it is impossible to get anything done. De Gaulle said that you couldn't run France because it had 200 kinds of cheese. I'd say you cannot run Latin America, but it has 22 or 25 or 35 political parties in Congress. That is one issue. The other issue is that, yes, many Latin American countries are federal, so you have national elections and state elections or provincial elections, and increasingly mayoral elections have been taking a more important role. So yes, it is absolutely true that there are two problems. First of all, we spend our lives in elections, and secondly, every election, including mayoral elections, becomes a test on the government, and therefore the government has no breathing space. This could all be changed. It is not written in stone that elections have to be held at those intervals. It is not written in stone that they could not be made to coincide. It is not written in stone that that you could not have one or two big rounds of elections, say every 4 years. But that requires changing the constitutions of these countries. And that is a very uphill task, of course, because you need big majorities, and given the fragmentation of politics, assembling those big majorities is extremely difficult. An example of that is my own country, Chile. We've been trying to write a constitution for the last 5 years. There have been 2 drafts. One was never put to a vote. The second one was turned down because it was a terrible draft. We're now giving it a third go, and there's some problems there. So my short answer is yes, that is an issue. Yes, it could be fixed, but the politics of fixing it are very, very difficult indeed.
Let me just add one small comment. I mean, this repetition of multiple elections at the federal and local levels with a multitude of political parties obviously are a fertile camp for grafts, for quotas, for producing policy outcomes that are clearly suboptimal and cater to interest groups. So this is a major issue. And I think it was a well-posed question, and it's one that's looming, but it requires, again, legal and constitutional changes.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Diego Herrera at the Inter-American Development Bank. They ask, is the lack of access to finance a structural issue for the Latin American region's productivity?
Let me briefly, I mean, the lack of financial repressions has been a constant feature of Latin America, and it obviously plays a role. I think that some countries have been able to include a lot more, households, businesses, and so on into the financial circle. But in general, the financial institutions, private financial institutions in Mexico, do a poor job, of inclusive coverage and so on. So this is a problem. I don't think it's one of the major ones, and it's something that's being corrected. Brazil has a very vibrant financial sector, much more inclusive. Chile does too. But it's one of those, items in the productivity list that are often cited and need to be addressed. But I don't think this is a major reform.
If I may, I agree. And while in Brazil we have benefited from what I think is a revolution in corporate governance, and it has paid off with the full kind of food chain of venture capital, private equity, and then regular listings in stock markets is functional. There's still an issue of the cost of loans, and there's a particular, I would say, problem with the loans for the poorest that tend to be, they lack collateral, either formal or informal collateral, because often they may have some collateral, but it's not one that can be, say, repossessed easily, and this is an issue. But if I may go back to Brazil, something I might have mentioned, if you look back at Brazil and Korea, 67 years, I think there are 2 issues that, besides the political, institutional issues that we have been discussing, that deserve a lot of attention and are very simple. Korea has improved its education spectacularly over these many decades, both in terms of quantity and quality, whereas Brazil has not. And Korea has been a high saving country as well, so they've been able to invest a lot more. And these are two issues that connect with a lot of the things we discuss in the report. I hope you take a look, but there are symptoms of something deeper that connects to the financial sector as well, particularly to the poorest parts of the country. In Brazil, in Brazil's case, a very large chunk of the population.
Thank you very much. Our next question is from Juan Carlos Del Rue, former chief economist of CEMEX and director of the Spanish Banking Association. Do you think the amount of investment needed to fight against climate change and protect biodiversity could be an inflection point for the region?
Well, I'll jump in here and invert the order. It could, but it probably won't. It should, but it probably won't.
Let me elaborate on that, because the question is good and Arminio is very much on the right track. There's a happy story making the circles, which says, look, the green transition is a growth story. Capital will flow to the countries that need it, and jobs will be created, and therefore we are doing good and we're doing well at the same time. And that story is feasible. That story is conceivable, but I think Arminio is right when he suggests that we're not anywhere near it. And the reason, Larry alluded to the things that Latin America could do for itself and the things that the world could do for Latin America, and this is one of the latter. After many reports, and several of us on this call have been parts of groups that have issued reports and calls and proposals, the fact is that the mechanisms for mobilizing capital from rich countries to less rich countries to finance green growth, those mechanisms are few and far between. And the amounts of money that are moving are tiny compared to the amounts of money that would be needed. And clearly one can say, well, countries can borrow, Latin American countries are middle-income countries, but obviously, after the pandemic, the borrowing capacity of the government, and in many cases of the private sector, is pretty much exhausted. One could also say, oh, but the private sector could pay for part of the bill. Yes, but of course, that means making those investments less risky, more attractive, more predictable. And that's also an uphill task. And the truth is that all the talk, or much of the talk, of international financial engineering, de-risking, partial guarantees, I welcome all of that. I've been a part in the drafting of such proposals, but we're nowhere near a point where a finance minister for Latin America could travel to Washington, visit the multilaterals, ask, where do I sign on the dotted line, sign on the dotted line, and go home with a big chunk of money. When that happens, we will be in a very different place. We're not there yet.
If I may, I don't think the G7 is taking this as seriously as it should either. But anyway, maybe we should skip to another question.
Let me just add something relating to the investment in supply chains in North America and what's happening in Mexico. This is happening despite government policies. The government of Andres Manuel has been, a clear drawback on clean energies, with the aim of preserving state monopolies in electricity and oil. So nearshoring is happening despite, energy policies being drawn in Mexico, which has huge potential for green energies. Hopefully this will change during the election, but it's an obstacle. And the same is happening in other countries in Latin America.
If I could just comment, the world is on fire. The fire department is still in the station. The good news is that there have been more profound improvements in technology than anyone could have imagined a decade ago. And there is every reason to expect continuing progress. The bad news is that when it comes to economics and financing, there has been much less than meets the eye. Many figures have been thrown around. There has been much discussion about offsets and net zero. Much of it would not meet any kind of generally accepted accounting principles if there were such in this area. And so efforts of this kind are still at a very early stage. Latin America, like the rest of the world, has a great stake in the global financial institutions and global institutions more generally becoming fit for 21st century purpose, which means both new ways of doing business and doing business on a substantially greater scale than has been the case in the past.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time for more questions. Thank you all for engaging in this robust discussion, and thank you to our speakers. We hope you will stay involved with the Group of 30, and we look forward to seeing you at other report launch webinars and upcoming events happening soon. Thank you.